This video is going to be a pretty brief summary of technological advancements in automobiles over the course of when they were invented until now. So let's start from the very beginning. As early as the 1670s, there was experimentation involving steam-driven vehicles that weren't on tracks, but it wasn't until 1771 a man named Nicholas Joseph Cugnot invented a steam-driven artillery wagon, which is what you're looking at right now. This is controversially the first car ever made. Now let's fast forward 104 years. It is 1885 and German inventor Carl Benz produces the first internal combustion gasoline-driven automobile. This, again controversially, is another candidate for the first real car with an upper hand over Cugnot's steam wagon because this is only meant to transport people. So moving on from creation. 1 year after Carl Benz's gas-driven car was made, Andreas Flocken, a different German inventor, made the first electric car, the Flocken Electrowagon. Then, in 1908, when Ford released the Model T, they revolutionized the car industry with their famous production lines, which can be held partially accountable for the lowering of prices of cars nationally. Now here are a few more early advancements. In 1911, the electric starter was introduced after someone died cranking an engine the previous year. Then, in 1925, cigarette lighters started being incorporated in cars. 4 years later, in 1929, 50 years after the automobile was invented, they realized that maybe brakes were important and started putting them on all four wheels. Then the next year, 1930, radio started appearing in cars. Moving on to 1934, two things happened. Coil spring suspension made its debut, and General Motors conducted the first ever crash test on a car. Jumping ahead a little, a few more inventions were made. In 1947, the first padded dashboard was made by American Tucker. Then, 2 years later, in 1949, the Saab 92 was the first car produced with a safety cage. Also in 1949, the Chrysler Crown Imperial was released and was the first car to include standard disc brakes. Then in 1956, power steering was invented. 2 years later, in 1958, the UN established the World Forum for Harmonization of Vehicle Regulations. This organization essentially forces every government to have some safety standards regarding cars and their features. Then the year after that, Volvo invented the three-point safety belt and allowed every company to use it for free, instead of charging them. Today, seat belts save 13,000 people every year. So I'd say it was a pretty successful invention. In the year 1964, two good things happened. Front seat belts became required, and Volvo invented the rear-facing child safety seat, or RFCSS. 4 years later, in 1968, the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards are established, making collapsible steering columns, side marker lights, and front seat three-point belts required. The next year, in 1969, headrests became required. Then the following year, 1970, Ford introduces a rear-wheel anti-lock brake system, or ABS. Also in 1970, Congress passed the Clean Air Act, which required emissions tests. 3 years later, in 1973, the first catalytic converter was released, which transforms hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, and nitrogen oxides into water vapor and other less harmful gases. In 1984, manufacturers found cost-effective ways to have airbags in all vehicles, so they started appearing more. Then 2 years later, in 1986, the third brake light became standard. Skipping ahead almost a decade, in 1994, crash testing became standard in all vehicles. Then the next year, 1995, the first navigation systems, the GPS for example, were available to the public. In 2000, manufacturers began producing hybrid cars, ones that use both gas and electricity. Then in 2009, Citroën invents an anti-skid system that helps with stopping in snow and other low-grip areas. And in the recent few years, Toyota and Volvo have developed an automatic braking system that uses sonar to prevent rear-end collisions before the driver can even react. So there you have it, from a steam-driven artillery wagon to sonar braking. The evolution of automobiles.